Employment or environment? Jobs versus biodiversity and ecological stability? It's not a simple or equal dichotomy. Employment and environment are not alternatives that can be pitched against one another. If there has to be conflict, which I'm afraid there is, the discussion must take into account all of the complexities contained within these two concepts. That is impossible without appropriate knowledge, which after nearly 10 years of learning I claim to have acquired. I'm sorry if people find this video annoying. I've been on the wrong end of people's reactions when I've voiced these opinions, so I don't express them again without careful deliberation. But please let's discuss this contentious topic, not sweep it under the carpet or make important decisions based on flawed or poorly informed assumptions. This worker is a member of a small team clear-felling a plantation of Sitka spruce. He has a job, but in carrying it out, he and his colleagues have been obliged to destroy a large area of the landscape in which they are working. Before the plantation they clear-felled in 2019, the site was species-rich native woodland, widely considered to be a desirable component of a healthy landscape. Replacing that with spruce trees, tightly packed and creating profound shade, was an ecological disaster in itself, but now, 50 years or so later, after logging with the big machines, biodiversity has been reduced to an all-time low, at its poorest since the land recovered from the last ice age 10,000 years ago. This sort of industrial land abuse requires more informed consideration than
we need to remove the timber as conveniently and economically as possible, and we need to create jobs. So we have no choice. On balance, it's reasonable to trash the landscape.
I'm not at all convinced. For an ecologist's view on this subject, see my YouTube video, Modern Forestry Part 1, Trashing the Scottish Landscape. Now back to salmon farming. Fish farm planning permissions are routinely decided through ill-conceived rationalisations. Council debates reveal that most planning committee members responsible for allowing or refusing fish farm planning applications don't know very much about salmon farming, in particular the extreme hazards of its environmental impact, often desperately underplayed by the advisor who opens the discussion. In one webcast planning committee meeting, a councillor admitted that she had little idea what salmon farming was about, and later, rather than abstain, as an honestly underinformed person should, voted to allow the planning application. The chair's summary was that the committee's choice was to be jobs or the environment, naively referring to the environment as the view, and the decision was based entirely on their emotionally justified need for jobs versus their ignorance of the environmental issues. Whether or not significant employment would be provided or taken was omitted from the discussion. It's a pathetically naive way of making important decisions, and the decision is generally wrong, other than from that single underinformed biased viewpoint. The situation is so much more complicated, requiring a much more mature approach and some joined-up thinking. Inconvenient as it may be, salmon farm planning permissions are not dependent upon a simple either-or option, with environment losing because it's more complicated than employment, which is preferable anyway because it's popular with voters. There are at least 3 major factors to be considered, each with its sub-factors. I offer no apologies. It's not my fault that this is a complicated topic, so this is where the joined-up thinking comes in. Permissions should be based on the place where, diagrammatically, all factors overlap. As long as planning committee members continue to be ignorant on the subject under discussion and unable to see beyond simplistic resolutions, salmon farming will continue to wreak havoc in Scottish loch and river ecosystems. Meanwhile, ignoring consultation comments provided by an informed public is tantamount to ignoring free advice from people who know what they're talking about. Whenever aquaculture companies apply for planning permission to install a new salmon farm, they habitually stress, above all other considerations, that the adjacent community will benefit from the jobs created. Communities innocently buy into these promises. Politicians who make decisions about these applications rely upon local communities for votes to maintain them in their chosen employment, so it's expedient for them to parrot this popular claim, ignoring or sidelining other aspects of the discussion. Indeed, we have heard them say that they find the environmental issues too complicated, so how can they judge their relevance? Job creation has become an automatic go-to argument whenever a political decision is required in response to a contentious issue. It's easy for the proposer because everybody knows it's the priority, don't we? Of course, employment is very important, but it's not the one and only priority. However, when it comes to pleasing the public, it is the easiest. In my presentation Holes, I listed 15 dangerous disadvantages of salmon farming. This industry is so riddled with problems that in my opinion all advantages are thoroughly outweighed by the disadvantages. But since it's such a prominent consideration, it's certainly a routine claim, the question of employment needs to be addressed. What I say next are considerations that, when expressed, generate so much anger that all but the most outspoken critics of the industry maintain a safe silence. But we don't deny the general need for employment, we simply question its necessity when the industry providing jobs is harmful to the natural environment and uses unconvincing promises of employment to appease an expectant public. When arguments about salmon farming arise, those of us who have familiarised ourselves with the disadvantages conclude that a few jobs are not worth the harm created by the employer's operations, while those who don't know about those problems simply plump for jobs, jobs, jobs. Whether or not significant employment will be created, whether jobs created will actually benefit local job seekers, whether there are job seekers in the vicinity, and whether existing activities providing employment might be affected. For instance, inshore fishing. And then, would not jobs provided by salmon farming be balanced or even exceeded by jobs created by the alternative industry suggested, closed containment fish farming? Let's tackle these discussion points one by one. Would jobs provided by a new salmon farm constitute significant local employment? It's very difficult to quantify fish farm employment with any precision because job numbers promised by salmon companies and jobs eventually provided are usually, shall we say, inconsistent. In planning applications, employment prospects tend to be, we suspect, temporarily exaggerated, while actual employment statistics tend to be disparate and variable. Since some jobs are full-time, some part-time, and some shared between adjacent or even distant farms, it's not easy to compare the promised with the achieved. The subject is controversial because, in the public mind, employment prospects tend to be polarised and emotionally charged. People who know little about salmon farming automatically raise the argument from employment, which can quickly become heated. After all, our politicians tell us all the time that their, and implied our, main ambition is job creation above all other considerations, environment often being of low status on the priority list. As demonstrated here, the subject is not simply a case of more jobs always being better than the status quo, and therefore installation of another fish farm can only be beneficial, full stop. It is much more complicated than that, with preservation of the marine environment bringing a substantial suite of contradictions in conflict with that single, arguably less significant issue. When trying to engage constructively in this conversation, my point of view, and indeed my character, have been uncharitably impugned as not caring about people. Of course, that's absurd, untrue, and insulting, but unfortunately it's also an impenetrable impediment to reasonable discourse. Would jobs created by a new salmon farm benefit local job seekers? Are there local job seekers to reap benefit? And at some sites, when employees are needed, will some or all have to be attracted from elsewhere? Local intelligence suggests that this is indeed the case. Locals are employed if they're available and willing, while unfulfilled posts are taken by outsiders. Of course, this in itself is not problematical, but it does call into question overblown promises to improve local employment and economies, which should be considered on a case-by-case basis, not just accepted without question. Will existing activities providing employment be affected by the installation of a new salmon farm? Yes. Creel fishermen who catch langoustine prawns, crabs and lobsters operate on seabeds in locations favoured by salmon farmers, notably the burrowed mud habitats that occur in sheltered locations. Creelers have already lost much of their traditional fishing ground, and it's likely that fish farm pollution has done little for the quality of their catches. Likewise, scallop divers have lost, and will continue to lose, to surface-occupying fish farms their access to seabeds suitable for their operations, taken over without asking. There is also a fierce controversy about the visual impacts of salmon farms and consequences for tourism. It is certainly worth considering. Property owners who provide a stunning highland outlook do not want their view disfigured with fish farms, and it is the view that attracts the visitors. A spoiled view means fewer visitors, less accommodation required, and less onshore employment. In the past, game fishing has been a significant income generator, requiring accommodation, boats, gillies, etc. The current situation of Loch Maree in Wester Ross shows what happens when a popular sea trout fishery declines to near zero. No fishers, an underused hotel and associated accommodation, and nowadays a single gilly with little to do in place of the 20 that used to be employed during the season. During his 50-year career, this gilly has witnessed this multifaceted, catastrophic decline. The sea trout began disappearing after the installation of the Loch Hugh salmon farm near the mouth of the river that drains from Loch Maree. It has recently closed, so will the sea trout population become re-established? If that does happen by natural ecological processes, will the currently held hypothesis of direct cause and effect be strengthened? It'll be a few years before we know. If one day,
oh happy day,
installation of new net cage salmon farms is forbidden and the alternative of closed containment fish farming on land is pursued, will the provision of jobs be equivalent or even improved? While jobs in net manufacture would be lost, change to closed containment would require construction of the tank installations, which would surely create even more jobs. Once established, closed containment fish farms would require at least equivalent numbers of staff to run them. Therefore, conversion to closed containment salmon farming would likely result in a net increase in employment. That employment would probably be situated out with the Scottish Highlands, which would be a net detriment in Highland communities. Whether or not that would be on balance significant would require serious consideration. Does employment provided by conventional sea-based net-cage salmon farms outweigh the harm caused to the marine environment? In my considered opinion, no. For full justification of that opinion, please open either the video or the book entitled Holes. And also, please bear in mind my contention that employment and environment are not alternatives that can be pitched against one another. They are separate issues that should be considered separately according to their particular merits.